Good evening. Good evening. My name is Karen DeBruin. I'm the director of the Honors Program, and I just wanted to welcome you to our 60th Honors Colloquium entitled Not Business as Usual, Business for the Common Good. Just a few housekeeping details. The exits are in the back and on both sides of the stage. The bathrooms are in the foyer, and there's no photos or video recording because we are live streaming this event. And before we introduce the colloquium, I would like to ask Lindsay Montanari to come up. Lindsay Montanari is an Indigenous Empowerment Center coordinator of the Tamaquag Museum, and she's here to formally acknowledge the land on which URI is situated. Thank you.
Askui kwasin na taswis Lindsay Ingaset na taswis wamasukatan at nahahigansek katabaswachi kamachi ninyukisak. So, as I said there, which I'll only translate for a few of you, I'm sure most of you know, I said, hi, my name is Lindsay in English. My name is Wamasukatan, or Loving Sea in the Narragansett language, and thank you so much for having me today. So, little backstory. I thought that I had 5 minutes, and I wrote 6 minutes worth of stuff, and I have 2 to 3. So, we're cutting out what I normally do for my intro to the land acknowledgement because I want to focus on the business-related stuff. But the main and important thing for you to know is that if you are in Rhode Island, you are on Narragansett land, which is cool and all, except for the bigger thing is that Narragansett people are still here. No matter where you are in Rhode Island, whether or not you see and recognize us, we're there. We're at Walmart, we're at BJ's, we're at TJ Maxx, all of the things. So that's the main important thing to know. And now I will talk about how I have engaged with some of these, the prompts that you guys had, right? It said how business affects stakeholders, including the environment, and also prompting for an action to call to alter the ways of production, consumption, and business success from an Indigenous perspective. Remember that just because this is the way America has always functioned does not mean it is the way that the people of this land have always functioned, nor does it mean it's how we should have to. Capitalism, putting other people down to get on top, having a monetary system, it's all colonial. My people did not have anything like money, and instead, we shared. We did not let anybody go without, and for that reason, there was no need for money. Let me break down some traditional ways that clash with the American business mindset. Lunch breaks. My people had food cooking all day long, and they ate when they were hungry and stopped when they were full. Instead of, like today, how we have a forced 30 minutes once throughout your shift to eat your lunch regardless of your hunger cues. This framework does not allow for people to get the energy needed to fuel them as their body asks for it. And it conditions us to stop listening to our bodies. The effects of this silencing of our bodies leaches into all aspects of the rest of our lives, quieting a piece of ourselves for the greater good of the company. Sustainability. So often capitalism and business does not just displace and kill Indigenous people, it displaces and kills Indigenous animals and plants. Here's an example. How many of you know the word moose? Show of hands. Anyone know the word moose? So, moose comes from the Narragansett word moose. But when is the last time you saw a moose in Rhode Island? Pretty much all of New England was clear-cut, so our trees are just babies. So often capitalism pushes away and kills and takes, and when there's no going back, when there is nothing but consequences to deal with, we look to the Indigenous people for solutions. But at that point, it's too late. Our solutions start and end with sustainability. It's secular. Often, it's not the quick and easy answer. It's looking at the consequences of our actions before they happen. How can you take and take and take and take and never give back and still expect more? Corporations over people. Do we truly care about the people who work in our businesses, or do we allow them to struggle for pennies for the corporation's benefit? The traditional way is to care about life and the living first, which means taking care of our people, place, and animals. What is the good of a product when workers struggle to live, when it pollutes our skies and waters and pushes out the animals? So often, even when people think they're doing good, it's still colonized. Here's some examples. Your child is sick and you must stay home because you have no one to watch them. Hope you don't need money for food or medicine. You're ill and you have two choices. Either come in sick and contaminate everybody, or don't get paid, even if you're working paycheck to paycheck. You get into a car accident. You probably need money now more than ever for a new car and medical bills. But you didn't make it to work today, so it's out of our hands. The inherent structure of business is anti-people. Push out product, push out product, push out product, use us as machines. Why have we built a society where we must pay to live so that people are born into debt, rather than putting human life first and product second? I'm not proposing that there's an easy solution, but do not let America's grounding in capitalistic values fool you into thinking there's only one way business can be successful. Redefine what success means to you. As you go about in business, I dare you to find creative ways to put life first. Remember all life, including that of our Indigenous people who are still here in Rhode Island. Remember the Narragansett people, and remember to make a difference for the next 7 generations. Aho.
Thank you. I'd like to invite now President Mark Parlange to come up to say a few words.
Thank you, Karen. So good to see all of you here this evening. First of all, happy start to the school year. I also want to thank for the land acknowledgement that we just heard, and I would also like to begin by reading our land acknowledgement, which we do before formal occasions like this evening. So the University of Rhode Island occupies the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. We honor and respect the enduring and continuing relationship between the Indigenous people in this land by teaching and learning more about their history and present-day communities, and by becoming stewards of the land we too inhabit. I also would like to remind that, and it's important to know, that this is the 3rd year that we are offering to members of the Narragansett tribe full scholarships to the university. It's of course just part of the support that we want to be able to provide for the Narragansett community. It's we're celebrating 100 years of the business college, and I'm just thrilled to be working with the College of Business. I'm really glad and looking forward to this honors symposium, and delighted. I don't know if our new dean of the College of Business, Sean Rogers, is also invited to speak, but it's thrilled to be able to work with him. And good to see all of you, and continue to see you each week here at these. So good evening. Thanks, Karen.
So as a relatively new director of the honors program, I've been through this now for 1 year. I was thrilled to inherit Business for the Common Good for a few reasons. First, as President Parlange has just referenced, it's celebrating the 100th anniversary of the College of Business, and it's also celebrating our 60th anniversary of the Honors Colloquium. The Honors Colloquium has been around for 60 years. Second, it represents and celebrates what the Honors Colloquium does best, which is to delve into the major issues of our time. And third, it also embodies the new direction that we are heading in honors education, which is namely to prepare our URI students to become change agents in this daunting world, change agents in the name of sustainability, and yes, change agents in the name of putting life first. Producing a series of this scope requires 1 to 2 years of planning and many campus partners. So I'd like to give thanks first and foremost to the Colloquium coordinators who have invested a lot of their time into this speaker series. The Colloquium coordinators, if all three of you could stand when I mention your names, that would be great. Christy Ashley. Is she around? Oh, she's back there, all the way back there. Doug Creed. And Sarai Argene. All from the College of Business. I'd like to thank all of the sponsors of the program, and especially the Office of the President here tonight. The sponsors, you can find them on the back of our programs, and also the Provost's office. I'd like to give a huge thanks to the Honors Program Coordinator, Anna Blake, who has worked tirelessly with our faculty coordinators to organize this year's colloquium, and also Melissa Stevens, who's our Honors Specialist, who has worked hard to bring the colloquium to the community through outreach and communication. And I'd also like to thank Sean Edmund Rogers, the Dean of the College of Business, for his collaboration on this event. And I'd now like to invite him up to say a few words.
All right, welcome and good evening. We're so excited that you're here, that you're joining us for this year's Honors Colloquium, the 60th anniversary, Business for the Common Good. Such an important topic, and also celebrating, as you've heard, the 100th anniversary of the URI College of Business. We've already given extended thanks to all of our organizers. I won't repeat that, but I'll just say that we're in for a treat. We've got so many outstanding topics this semester, this Honors Colloquium, that really dives into the various aspects of how business can be leveraged to address society's grand challenges and generate good for us all. And we're extremely pleased tonight to have our guests. So we're in for a treat, and thank you for being here.
And now to introduce our speaker, I'd like to welcome up Doug Creed.
Good evening and, am I heard? Good evening and welcome to you all. It's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest speaker, Professor Jerry Davis. Since receiving his PhD in business from Stanford, Professor Davis has taught at 3 of America's premier business schools, Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, Columbia Business School, and finally, the University of Michigan, where he is the Gilbert and Ruth Whitaker Professor of Business Administration, a professor of sociology, and also the director of the school's Impact Studio. Widely published in management, sociology, and finance, Professor Davis' research is broadly concerned with the effects of finance on society, changes in the corporate economy, how ideas of corporate social responsibility have evolved, and whether shareholder capitalism is a viable model for economic development, whether there is existing a viable organizational alternatives to shareholder-owned corporations in the United States. His work helps us to understand why corporations in America look the way they do, what impact they have on the people who count on them, who has the power to control them, and how finance and technology and law have changed all of these things over the last 3 decades. During his august career, he has had several leadership positions in the Academy of Management, has been editor-in-chief of the field's premier empirical journal, the Administrative Science Quarterly, and now, professors will appreciate this, this made my eyes pop, has served on 80 completed dissertation committees and chaired 23. There are people throughout our discipline who are grateful to have had, or to have Jerry as a friend and mentor, and his students serve at all, or on the faculty of all the world's greatest business schools. So join me, please, in welcoming Jerry Davis.
Thank you. I will never live up to that, which makes me very excited. I am really excited to be here today at the 100th anniversary of the business school, which is kind of amazing. We're coming up on our 100th in a couple of years, so we're going to learn from how you did this. One is I'm definitely getting pins. Really excited about the 60th anniversary of the Honors Colloquium. I met the honors students today, and they are amazing. University of Rhode Island rocks. I am so impressed by the quality of the students, the quality of minds that you have here in the honors program. So really excited to be here. Thank you to the organizers, Sergey and Doug. Thank you in particular for inviting me and placing your faith in me to kick things off in a spicy way, which I hope I'll be able to do. I also want to acknowledge my brother, Larry Davis, who's here in the audience. So after an august military career where he spent a little bit of time in Rhode Island, he moved back here around 1982, went to URI on the GI Bill, and got his undergraduate degree from the College of Business in 1991, and he will never leave Rhode Island. So I always wondered, you've been here 40 years, what is it about Rhode Island? And now I know, it is magical. So really excited to be here. So I have to tell you a couple of things about myself to key all of this off. So our theme today is corporate power, business, and the common good. And Professor Creed asked me to define common good, and I racked my brain and couldn't come up with an answer to that. What I really want to do is talk about the different ways that society shapes itself to get to the common good. That's going to make sense in a moment here. Two things you need to know about me for this talk to make sense. One is that I was raised Catholic, and that means that I am always primed to feel guilt in every situation. Whether I did anything or not, I always feel guilty. The second is that I majored in philosophy, which means A, that I was unemployable, but B, that there are always reasons for me to feel guilty. Philosophy just draws you in to feeling guilt about different things. And the reason why I highlight this philosophy background is that the class that I hated most as an undergraduate was ethics. And that's why I'm in a business school today. Just kidding, Dean Rogers. But I had an ethics professor who was always talking about these thought experiments that drove me insane because they were so ridiculous. Imagine that there's a trolley, it's about to run over 5 people, but if you pull a lever, it only kills 1 person. I was like, that's never going to happen in real life. But his favorite one was, imagine that every time I step on this floorboard, someone on the other side of the planet gets a painful electric shock. It's like, He goes, yep, painful electric shock. It's like, all right, dumb, but why are we imagining this? And he says, well, are you responsible? Your action is causing this. Are you responsible for that harm that you are causing? And I always thought, that is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. This has no application in the real world. No wonder nobody's majoring in philosophy anymore. But as a grown-up, I have changed my mind, and I will tell you why. So imagine that you need more companionship, that your life is bereft of the relationships that you need, and you decide that now is the time to get an adorable kitten. That the way to make your life more enriched is to have an adorable cat, and you're going to devote yourself to the well-being of that cat. And so you spare no expense. You go out and buy Fancy Feast, the delicious seafood-flavored cat chow that kittens love best of all. You are doing a good deed out there in the world, making this cat happy. But then imagine that after you've been buying this cat food for a while, you come across the following article, headlined, "Nestle Admits Slavery and Coercion Used in Catching Its Seafood." Wait, what? That's right. First, Nestle bought Ralston Purina, bummer. But second, wait a minute. After being notified by activists that there was slavery in their supply chain, Nestle dug into it and said, I'll be damned, it's true. The boats off the coast of Thailand that are catching these shrimp are staffed by slave labor. And Nestle said, yep, it's true. We'll try and do better next time. Well, this is bumming me out. How guilty should I feel about buying cat food? I didn't know that every time I stepped on this board, basically, I was engaged in slavery. I've got a can of cat food right here. This is a morally compromised can of cat food, which bums me out. I'm already Catholic. I already felt guilty, and now I feel even worse about it. So, one way you might respond to this is to say, I'm going to need some chocolate, because chocolate makes everything better. I've got some bad news for you. If you buy Nestle or Mars or Hershey chocolate, odds are good that child slaves in the Ivory Coast on the west coast of Africa were involved in the creation of that chocolate. Wait a minute, I can't even eat chocolate anymore without feeling guilty? I'm really going to need to reach for a cold one now. Oh, damn it. Okay. I also can't drink this beer because all sides of the spectrum are bummed out about Bud Light for various reasons. So all of a sudden, my philosophy professor's dumb thought experiment is the world that we live in today. That because of the nature of disaggregated capitalism, you just never know what ethical issues are raised when you buy a product. Another way to think about this, why is every trip to the Stop and Shop a walk through an ethical fire swamp now? How do we get ourselves to a point where buying cat food or beer or chocolate is ethically fraught? And what I want to do is open up this discussion for the entire semester with this particular theme. What is it about the nature of disaggregated capitalism that leaves us facing these dilemmas on a regular basis? So that's the big theme. Why do I feel guilty? Why should you all feel guilty? And ultimately, what can we do about it? And that's where the common good question comes in. Okay. So I said I wasn't going to define the common good, but I do want to talk about ways that you can get to the common good. So think about this not as an individual choice, do I buy cat food or not, but a societal choice. How do we organize our decision processes to get to the common good? There's a couple of major options. One is through markets, and one is through democracy. And the theme of this talk is going to be the interplay between markets and democracies and how we decide between these two. So the one thing you can be certain of in every business school in America is that sooner or later, you're going to be forced to read this damned Milton Friedman article, "The Social Responsibility of Business is to Increase Its Profits." Every business school, sooner or later, on Ethics Day, you're going to encounter this Milton Friedman article. And I'm here to, the good news of this is, once you've read the title, you're basically done. Much like Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In, you just need to know the title and you pretty much know the punchline of the article. So that's great. Okay, social responsibility, I got your point. But Friedman does actually go through a bit of a dissection of how do we decide between markets and democracy. And deep in the article, he talks about how do we decide between these two? What are the implications of using markets or democracy to come to these conclusions? In markets, all of our interactions are voluntary. Everybody goes in with their senses. They make voluntary transactions, and everybody does what's best for them, and we're all made better off. So this is about a sort of a transactional view of how we get to the common good. In democracy, I'm delighted to be here in New England because this is my understanding of pretty much every evening in New England. You're going to a town hall meeting listening to somebody making a speech, you know, they've got some agenda and they're going to speak from the heart about some issue of importance to them. They're going to reason with each other, and then they're going to take a vote, and they're going to decide to do that. So 2 options. And it's pretty clear from reading what Friedman had to say that the one he loves best of all is markets. The political principle that underlies a market mechanism is unanimity. In an ideal free market resting on private property, no individual can coerce any other. All cooperation is voluntary. All parties to such cooperation benefit, or they need not participate. So from his perspective, markets are all about mutually voluntary interaction that makes everybody best off. So that's the markets end of the spectrum. And then he weighs in on democracy, and it's a little bit more gimlet-eyed here. So the political principle here is conformity. The individual must serve a more general social interest, whether that be determined by a church or a dictator or a majority. So you kind of think about those 3 options and say, wait a minute, this is not just democracy. He's putting on an equal plane a church or a dictator or a majority as if they were essentially similar ways to get to political conclusions. Now, you might have a vote and get a say in what is done, but if you're overruled, you must conform. So it's very clear that Milton Friedman loves the market solution better, that this is more of a last resort. So markets and democracy. How does this play out in the context of business? So think about the nature of the corporation and democracy in America. I mentioned the philosophy major thing. I'm going to hammer that a couple of times so that you can all skip it and not end up in law school, which would just be a disaster for you. As a philosophy major, one of my favorite things was to finally go to visit Athens in Greece, the birthplace of Western philosophy, the birthplace of Western democracy, a really important spring of Western civilization. So I loved going to visit Athens and seeing the Parthenon. This is me in the Agora. That's the thing in the background there. And the fun thing, the Agora means marketplace. And it was a marketplace, but it was also the site of debate and democracy. People would give speeches there. People would argue there. Schools would take place. So the Agora was both markets and democracies intermingled. And I'm here to tell you that corporations also exist at the intersection of markets and democracy. If you think about the rise of the major corporation at the turn of the 20th century in the US, that was seen as a threat to democracy, and not just by commies. Teddy Roosevelt, Louis Brandeis, many others were anxious about the rise of large corporations. And Roosevelt had a particular diagnosis of this. His hypothesis was that because of economies of scale, capitalism inherently tends towards the concentration of industry and finance. Because bigger is cheaper, we end up with really big corporations that are cheap, but they're also economically powerful. And that was a dilemma we had to deal with. Big is cheap, but big is also influential in ways that we're not sure how best to deal with. So over the course of most of the 20th century, progressive movements sought to maintain democratic control in the face of economic concentration. And the way that Roosevelt framed it was, look, mergers, giant corporations are inescapable. They're cheaper, they're going to win. And so what we need to do is not prevent mergers, but completely control these new things in the interest of the public welfare. So this was democracy's job to tame corporations to behave themselves and contribute to the common good. And over the course of the century, Congress sought to tame corporate power in a set of ways. The Progressive Era, we had the Sherman Act in 1890 for limiting monopoly power. 1914 was the Clayton Act and the FTC Act regulating how companies interacted with their competitors and their suppliers. And then, in the wake of the Great Depression, We had regulations on capital markets, the 33 Banking Act, known as Glass-Steagall, 33 and 34 Securities Acts, and then labor markets through the Wagner Act, which enabled unions to organize more effectively, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. In a brief period, a whole lot of regulation was passed to force corporations to behave themselves. And we had this war. We're going to skip the part about World War II. When we got to the other end, the other side of the Second World War, we had soulful-looking corporations. So one of the things that happened through the war is that corporations got even bigger than they had ever been. This is a picture of the Ford River Rouge plant around 1945. It had 100,000 employees. It was the world's most vertically integrated factory. They made steel, they made cement, they made glass. Raw materials came in one end, Model A's or tanks came out the other end. Both of my grandfathers were welders at the Ford Rouge plant when it was part of the arsenal of democracy. This was what big corporations looked like at the end of the war. So they'd grown a lot bigger, but they'd also grown a soul. What we expected of corporations ended up looking really different. So Carl Kaysen was a Harvard economist in the 1950s. He ended up being in the Kennedy administration. And he said, no longer the agent of proprietorship seeking to maximize return on investment, management sees itself as responsible to stockholders, employees, customers, the general public, and perhaps most important, the firm itself as an institution. His point is that Friedman idea is not right. Corporations and their managers feel responsible to lots of different stakeholders. He went on to talk about this. Leadership in local charitable enterprises, concerned with factory architecture and landscaping, provision of support for higher education, thank you donors, even research in pure science to name a few. Corporations had responsibilities. They were social institutions. It turns out that some research shows a handful of interesting findings. One is bigger employers paid better. Big companies paid more for the same jobs than small companies did. Bigger companies reduced inequality. They brought wages closer together, and they created pathways to the middle class. Turns out that the bigger our corporations got, the lower our inequality was. 1970 was the high point for big companies and the lowest point in inequality in American history. So giant firms, low inequality, because of the kind of regulation that we encouraged on corporations. It also turns out that big companies are a lot easier to regulate than a bunch of small companies or private businesses. An ironic fact is, if you want evidence, look at the administration of Richard Milhouse Nixon. I know we thought he was a conservative, and he was kind of a conservative, but the regulations that businesses hate most of all, many of them came during the Nixon administration. From 1970 to 1972, he created the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. The EEOC got litigation authority. He launched the Environmental Protection Agency to curb pollution, the Consumer Product Safety Commission. It is the damnedest thing. During 2 years of Nixon's administration, big corporations were made to be healthier, safer, more equitable workplaces. Their pollution was lowered. They had to make safer products. Thank you, democracy. You know, thank you to a regulatory state led by Richard Nixon, making companies behave themselves better. And thanks to all of this, we moved onward to a bright and prosperous future that we all remember the 1970s to be. If you think about all aspects of American culture during the 1970s, fashion, we got bell-bottoms, polyester. Think about cars and industry, music and culture, additional polyester. Great opportunities to meet our friends and neighbors while waiting in line for gasoline. So this is kind of what the world brought to us. And that's why the 70s was remembered as the greatest decade for American democracy and the economy. Okay, that part is false. Nobody remembers the 70s that way. It was economically a nightmare. There was inflation, there was high unemployment, the economy was in the doldrums. So a very dark time economically. And that created an opportunity for the Milton Friedmans of the world to lead a backlash against soulful corporations. That idea of soulful corporations never sat well with this particular MF, Milton Friedman. So there was a backlash against the notion of soulful corporations. And in fact, Friedman was very clear about this. He described this whole idea as being the equivalent of socialism. Businessmen believe they're defending free enterprise when they claim that business is not concerned merely with profit, but also desirable social ends. He goes on to say, in fact, they are preaching pure and unadulterated socialism. Trying to get businesses to be socially responsible is a form of socialism. Yikes, if you're under 40, that's supposed to sound bad, in case you didn't know that. So this was sort of his take on the whole thing. Well, how do we align these things together? How do we get corporations to behave themselves if we don't want to hand it off to democracy? And one thought is to force them to focus in a laser-like way on shareholder value. It's paradoxical, but let me break it down for you in one slide that tells you everything you need to remember from much of business school. Efficient markets and social welfare, a syllogism, because I mentioned that philosophy major thing. Okay, first, we know from Milton Friedman that firms maximize social welfare by maximizing profits. And this is probably so self-evident that there's no reason to even unpack why this is so obviously true, right? So we'll just move on to the second one. Share price is the best measure of sustainable profitability. If you take a finance class, you learn about the efficient market hypothesis, and you learn that the stock market is really good at predicting a company's future profits through its share price. In fact, Professor Michael C. Jensen of the Harvard Business School said, "No proposition in any of the sciences is better documented than the efficient market hypothesis. Trust the stock market to price this thing." Therefore, firms maximize social welfare by maximizing share price. Boom, done. A very simple syllogism gets us to why companies should focus laser-like on shareholder value, and that will get them to the common good. Great. If shareholder value is so good, how do we make sure that everyone in America buys into this idea? How do we enroll Americans in the ownership society? And it turns out that for most of the 20th century, corporate ownership in the US was highly dispersed. This is an ad for AT&T around 1910. And it is their shareholders. Here's the widow opening up her dividend check from AT&T, and here's all the many millions of shareholders of the AT&T Corporation. And their theme was, it's not bankers somewhere in New York that controls AT&T. No, it's widows and orphans that buy stocks. Thanks mostly to the 401k plan, at this point, half of American families are invested in the stock market. So this orange line is how many people buy and sell individual shares, and it's about 20%. Hardly anybody actually uses Robinhood to buy shares. Overwhelmingly, when people invest in the stock market, they buy a mutual fund. And it went from sort of 1981, about 20%, to more than half of all American families invested in the stock market. One of the results of this is that the size of the biggest institutional investors is totally mammoth. So there was a time 10 years ago when I could say BlackRock and no one in the room knew what I was talking about. Now people know a bit more. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, because of all of that pension money pouring in, the three of them together own about 25% of the average S&P 500 corporation. So think of a big company, odds are good that these three companies own about a quarter of its shares. This is weird. This is not something that has ever happened before in American history. To break it down a bit, Vanguard is the largest shareholder of 351 of the 1,000 largest U.S. corporations. Apple and Microsoft, Vanguard's their biggest shareholder. AT&T and Verizon, JP Morgan Chase and Citigroup, Exxon, Chevron, Phillips, Marathon, UPS and FedEx, you name it, they have the same largest shareholder. To make it even more graphic for you, it's a little hard to read back there, but oh, there's CVS right there. Vanguard, biggest shareholder, 8.7%. Of the 25 biggest American corporations, Vanguard is the largest shareholder of 16 of them. Utterly unprecedented in American history. It's kind of like the revenge of Teddy Roosevelt. Finance becomes more concentrated. All right, super interesting. How does this actually make us all better off? In what way does shareholder capitalism make us better off? And this is a moment where I have to give you a bit of a trigger warning. If you're a libertarian, sorry, Larry, I'm going to say a couple of rude things about shareholder capitalism here, but I think they're reasonably well-grounded. Okay. Listed corporations, companies whose shares are traded on the stock market, inevitably prioritize share price because of the many mechanisms of corporate governance. So when we say creating shareholder value, what we mean in practice is increasing share price. If you ask a finance professor, they'll say, no, shareholder value is an unobserved construct, and it's the projected future value of the company's cash flow. But practically speaking, when they say shareholder value, they mean share price. I know that sounds arcane, but that is what they actually have in mind. The US has involved a vast matrix of institutions that force corporations to focus on share price. They have equity analysts, activist hedge funds, state corporate law, boards of directors, share-based compensation, a market for corporate control. At the end of the day, and this is the controversial sounding part, so just consider this an op-ed, Wall Street hates companies that create jobs, that pay well, and that engage in corporate social responsibility. Why would I say something like this? A few years ago, American Airlines negotiated an agreement with its pilot and flight attendant unions, gave them a reasonable raise. As someone who just flew to Providence yesterday, I really like having happy, well-paid people that got enough sleep and didn't drink the night away the night before. So they negotiated a labor agreement, and their share price went down 5.2% that day when they made the announcement. But it didn't just go down. Equity analysts dove in to give them trouble about it. This is frustrating. Labor is being paid first again. Shareholders get the leftovers, Citi analyst says. Shareholders get the leftovers. For finance nerds, the definition of a shareholder is that they are the residual claimants. By definition, they're the ones that always get the leftovers. That is the single defining feature of being a shareholder. But anyway, they are getting the leftovers. Another analyst said, we're troubled by American Airlines' wealth transfer of nearly $1 billion to its labor groups. So the theory is that there's a very direct conflict of interest. Either the money goes to shareholders or it goes to laborers. It's not that it grows the pie, it's that it's getting transferred to the labor groups. You may have seen this guy. And it's hard to tell if this is the real human or like the cartoon or wax human. It's like, I don't know, his skincare regime is on fleek, as they used to say 8 years ago. But there's a series, like starting last November, Facebook started laying people off, and they got egged on by Wall Street. So Facebook lays off 11,000 people, and its share price goes up. That was last November. In March, Meta stock climbs after report of more layoffs. Here's why. That was in March. In April, Meta has started its latest round of layoffs, focusing on technical employees. After plummeting in 2022, Meta's stock prices bounced back this year on optimism that massive cost cuts will boost productivity. It seems very clear if you want to drive the price up, don't employ people. I know, seems weird, maybe I got that wrong, but I don't think so. Because there's a flip side of it. Well, we'll get to that in a second. So the stock market also hates do-gooder companies. So has anybody heard of a certified B corporation? Oh, not so many. Oh, go out and learn about certified B Corps. You'll like it. So these are certified do-gooders. Like you have to go through a vetting process to document that you are doing well on environment, social, and governance. So companies that are certified B, they have committed to making the world a better place. So in the last 3 years, a surprising number of certified B corporations went public in the United States. And so I wanted to track how's their stock doing since they went public. And this thing up here that's circled in blue, that's how their stock price has changed since the day of their initial public offering. So Lemonade, an insurance company, stock price down 68% from when it went public. Vital Farms, stock price down 70%. App Harvest, stock price down 99.44% from the day that it went public. Amalgamated Bank, not so bad. This is sort of a union-owned bank. Have a different story to them. Coursera, down 65.3%. Planet Labs, PBC, down 65.7%. Zevia, Public Benefit Corp, down 81%. Warby Parker, down 72.6%. Allbirds, down 95% since going public. And Greenlight Biosciences, down 96.95%. Now, is this statistically significant? Yes. Every single one of them has tanked since going public. The stock market will not allow you to exist as a do-gooder company, is my takeaway from this particular set of data. I'd be happy to be proven wrong, but find me one. I looked hard. This is everyone I could find. On the other hand, the stock market does love particular kinds of companies, and there are companies that have as few employees or assets as possible. So an example of this would be the Nike Corporation. They make sneakers and some other stuff. And what's interesting about Nike is from the very beginning, Nike was an asset-light model. That is, they did the design and they did the marketing, but they did not do the manufacturing. They contracted that out to vendors elsewhere. So take the car company that I mentioned. I had the River Rouge plant where my grandfathers worked, highly vertically integrated. Today, the River Rouge plant assembles F-150 pickup trucks. You can go visit it in Detroit. They have factory tours. It's got a green roof. It's very quiet. It's very clean. It's a lovely factory in Dearborn, and they make Ford F-150 Lightning trucks. One of their new competitors is an electric pickup truck made by a company called Fisker. Fisker went public about 3 years ago. They have a totally dope electric pickup truck. The cab is, or the back is extensible, so it's this really interesting design by this company, Fisker. Fisker, as of this morning, is worth $2.25 billion. Not bad for a pretty new car company in a pretty crowded space. And when the company went public, they explained that their model was basically to be the Nike of car companies. We don't want to be a vertically integrated car company. We're not going to do our own manufacturing. It would be stupid for any EV startup to make a brand new factory. It's very clear to them that there's already enough factories in the world that they can rent one. So instead, they were using Magna International, a Canadian contract manufacturing company, to make their first product. And then the next product would be made by Foxconn, which is a company that makes iPhones. So they were not going to be building the cars themselves. According to their most recent 10K statement that you can get from the SEC, as of February 17th, 2023, we employed approximately 850 full-time employees. 850, approximately 2 Walmarts worth of employees running a publicly traded car company worth $2.25 billion. So it's pretty clear what is valued and what is not so much valued in the system. This is more like what the future looks like. You can try and be a do-gooder company, but it turns out that systematically, companies that are more highly rated on corporate social responsibility are also most likely to get activist hedge fund attacks. So if you watched Salesforce.com last fall, they were being lauded for their ESG Vanguard activities. and they had not one but two activist hedge funds buy more than 5% of the shares and bully the company into both layoffs and spin-offs. So it's really hard to be a do-gooder company and not attract hedge funds. And yeah, we're not in New Jersey. We can talk about this one. The pushback that I will usually get is, but what about Johnson & Johnson? What about Tylenol? Johnson & Johnson has the credo where they talk about making the world better and health coming first. And they seem to be sort of a counterexample to all of this because of their strong, true belief that they exist to make the world healthier. I will just quickly point out their talcum powder subsidiary that they put together in Texas so that they could go bankrupt and leave the parent company safe from the asbestos and cancer lawsuits. Okay, sorry to bum you out. Can we make this better? This is where it's starting to turn a little bit brighter, I hope. Is there any way under a shareholder capitalist system that we can reorient companies back to the common good? If it's not going to be government that is forcing companies to behave, can their own shareholders force companies to behave differently? And this is a live battle going on today. We've still got Milton Friedman out there. If you go to a business school, many of the courses you take will say the social responsibility of business is to increase its profits. It's taken for granted that this has been proven and that we can't revisit it. But on the other hand, we now have the CEOs of 200 major American corporations, the Business Roundtable, saying, actually, we've thought this thing through. JK. That means just kidding if you're over 40. Just kidding about the whole shareholder value thing. Actually, we redefine the purpose of a corporation to promote an economy that serves all Americans. They say, they published a statement on the purpose of a corporation. They commit to lead their companies for the benefit of all stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and shareholders. So in some sense, the Business Roundtable is saying, back to the future. We thought Carl Kaysen got this thing right, that we exist to serve all shareholders, and we're going to be thinking differently about our responsibilities as business people. And I'd love to be able to quit there and say it all worked. But I've been awake for the last 3 years, and that's not exactly what happened, unfortunately. So one thing that happened at the same time is a rapid acceleration of environmental, social, and governance investing. Think of it as do-gooding investing. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about this, but something like a quarter of the dollars invested in the US are guided by ESG criteria, trying to grade companies based on a set of criteria so that the good companies are rewarded and the bad companies are punished. Seems like a reasonable response. Shareholders, not government, trying to get companies to behave themselves. And yet, almost immediately, it seemed, ESG became labeled as corporate wokeism. So Elon Musk, whom you've heard of, said last year, I'm increasingly convinced that corporate ESG is the devil incarnate. Mark Andreessen, venture capitalist, the guy that started Netscape long before you were born, quotes Peter Thiel as saying, ESG is just a hate factory. It's a factory for naming enemies, and we should not be allowing them to do that. When you think ESG, you should be thinking Chinese Communist Party. Just to be clear, he doesn't like the Chinese Communist Party. If there's any ambiguity about that part, he didn't think that this was a good thing. Former Vice President Mike Pence, you may remember him, published an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal saying that ESG is exactly what Milton Friedman objected to. It was unelected shareholders forcing companies to do things that they couldn't get elected representatives to do. And this is a weird thing to read. It allows the left to accomplish what it could never hope to achieve at the ballot box or through competition in a free market. Unelected shareholders forcing companies to do things that they didn't want to do. Wait a minute. I thought this was voluntary market activity where I thought this was exactly what he should have dreamed of. Turns out it's not. Like the Chinese Communist Party, a low ESG score can be devastating for companies. So weirdly enough, that Milton Friedman snake is now eating its own tail in the form of shareholder activists being seen as anti-democratic. Weird. Be careful what you wish for. BlackRock CEO Larry Fink started writing letters to CEOs saying, you know, I would love to see companies behave themselves a little bit better. Here are some thoughts for you. He's now considered to be a commissar, some kind of sinister leader of a corporate woke movement. The culture war is coming for your 401k. When do the human rights tribunals begin for Larry Fink? Oh no! ESG equals everyone suffering guaranteed. Suddenly, a set of anodyne metrics for corporate behavior have been turned into a sinister conspiracy for one world government in controlling corporate America. Meanwhile, governments in some of our more Confederate states are passing laws to prevent companies from BlackRock from selling their wares to public pension funds within the state of Texas. This is quoting Scooby-Doo, by the way, Ruh-roh. ESG seemed like an idea, but now it's become as controversial as Bud Light beer. Weird. Okay, so that was a little dark. Can we turn it down a little bit to get a little bit darker? So the last thing we should be thinking about, and then we'll get to the bright spot, maybe. Should we be worried about anything else? The shocking thing is that shareholder capitalism may be collapsing under its own weight. So maybe we don't need to do anything in particular because the number of publicly listed corporations in the US has dropped by over half over the past 25 years. Since the late 90s, the number of companies listed on stock markets in the US has gone down, 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 and never come back up. That's weird. Wait a minute. That's never happened before. What exactly is going on here? You might be thinking that's because all the big companies bought each other and they become monopolies. That's not it. These were the Dow Jones blue chip companies in 1988. And if you're under the age of 50, you've never heard of most of them. Westinghouse, Woolworth, Eastman, Kodak, Bethlehem Steel. You've never heard of these companies before. Of the 30 Dow Jones blue chip companies in 1988, only about 7, 8 of them are left today. The ones in red are still around. It's like going to your 30th high school reunion, looking up the football team, the people that used to be like the ballers, the rock stars of the school 30 years ago, and now like, wow, they do not look so good. Like a lot of them are dead and some of them are living in halfway houses, and like GE used to be the quarterback, but now it's kind of a little bit overweight and a little balding, not looking so great anymore. It's a little bit weird what became of the major corporations in America back then. They have not bought all their competitors. That's not the story of what happened. Something else is going on here. You might say, great, big corporations are going away and they're going to be replaced by exciting new startups. That's not it either. The number of public corporations, companies going public per year has dropped dramatically. There was a big fad during the 1990s, like Beanie Babies and polyester pants and Clinton administrations. But I'm here to tell you it is not coming back. We had one little blip year in 2021, but then last year it was back to very low numbers. So the IPO markets are not replenishing the public corporations. So that leaves us at an exciting place. What do we do at this point? Public corporations, shareholder capitalism has brought us to this complicated place where we're facing ethical fire swamps. What do we do next? Yes!
So, as consumers, what's the best thing that we can do or we're responsible for to put us towards a better tomorrow, I guess? It's a really hard question.
No, it's a great question. Like, what can we do as consumers? is exactly the right question. And what I want to do is both try to give an answer, but also say this does not get resolved at the level of individuals. If we ask every one of you in this room, reinvest your pension funds or buy only ethical products, it's not going to work. It's really a collective action problem, that the solution to this problem really takes place at the system level. So the reason I talked about markets and democracy is not just because I love abstractions, although I really, really do, but it's because those kind of choices are made at a societal level, not an individual level. If I asked you, evaluate every product that you buy every day using the following ethical criteria, you'd have to quit school and spend all your time on shopping. Just the costs for individuals to do that are enormous. The only solution can be a collective one. And you can think about it in a few ways. You could imagine saying, I'm going to be the online retailer that actually puts the work into vetting every product that we sell. We're only going to sell things that are certified B corporations or that meet certain ethical criteria, and then you pour all of your shopping dollars into that entity. Or you can imagine it more at a state level. I feel like Nixon does not get enough credit for those agencies. He did a lot of bad things, like, yeah, not a trivial number, a fair number of bad things. But in some sense, that was the right impulse. Like, how do you make employers safer, less polluting, more equitable? Like, that felt like the right solution to me. So much as I've also learned that if you try to force consumers to behave themselves, they hate you for it. Much as I try to make people feel guilty for eating meat, it never works. It always backfires. So, yeah, but thanks for the question. Oh, yeah, please.
When you were showing us the articles, it seemed like there was definitely a correlation between liberalism and the left being associated with like wokeism and being the side that supports all this. Do you feel that the right's reaction to like business for the common good and these environmental sustainability changes and such, do you think that their reasoning for going against that is just they don't want to be associated with wokeism in the left, or do you think that there's a valid argument behind that?
Yeah, my sense is that wokeism is a carefully thought through and crafted term that could be used to smear people. So much like critical race theory, which is now used to refer to anything having to do with race, it gets called critical race theory. The same thing is happening with woke, using it as a term that can tar any entity that it gets associated with. I think the real target for the ESG funds is not the S so much and not the G so much, but the sustainability part, particularly oil companies and their supporters. I think they're the major force behind that particular social movement. Oh, thanks. Oh, and Doug, when do we need to pull the plug?
We can take more questions.
Sure, yeah, let's take 2 more questions if we could. Thanks. Thank you for raising the average age of questioners.
Thank you for recognizing that. The question I have is, what you're referring to is a fundamental base upon which criteria can be chosen, which all societal members agree are valuable essentials for their survival. When you referred to Nixon, you showed the Environmental Protection Agency as one of those. You showed the OSHA, Safety and Health Administration. Why is it that we cannot come to some semblance of agreement on these fundamentals? Because they are clean air, clean water, food which is not contaminated with some degree of a potentially carcinogenic or harmful substance. Why is it that there cannot be some agency that creates these criteria that are fundamental? And then from the fundamental, you can project outward like 1,000 shots of light. Who's not meeting these criteria? Bring that light back to the fundamental nucleus of importance, and then create methods over time which motivate and facilitate the return to the fundamentals?
Yeah, no, that is a lovely question. So why can't we find common agreement on that? That one, I'm honestly going to lay this one at the feet of Milton Friedman and his successors, that by fundamentally delegitimating the role of democratic governance, it's made it very difficult for us to decide one good way to make decisions is to do it democratically. By posing markets as this fundamental alternative that is self-correcting, it almost rules out the alternative. Like, it's a very slippery move to say a church or a dictator or a majority as if they're on the same plane there. And so legitimating answers that require market transactions inherently delegitimates the alternative, which is let's get together, talk it over, and take a vote. So that's sort of a part one. I actually think ESG is probably going to collapse under its own weight, but the basic idea of using new technologies to collect and disseminate better behavior on business, that I'm very optimistic about. That increasingly we have the technologies to be able to trace supply chains, to know where did this cocoa come from? Where did this shrimp come from? That increasingly we have the tools to create more transparency, more measurable business behavior. So if I were to put my money on a solution, a big part of it, it might not be the revival of democracy. I'd love to vote in favor of that. But I'm also pretty optimistic about technology in enabling more transparency and better understanding so people know what choices they're making. So they're not saying, I wonder if this cat food contains slave shrimp, that they know, that they've got better access to information about it. So for me, that's one of the sources of optimism. Thanks.
One more question, anyone?
So is this dilemma something unique to the United States? Are we seeing this globally? Are there countries that seem to have figured this out? Or is it across the board for everyone?
Thank you. I love that question. It is remarkable how diverse different countries are in implementing the same technology and what kind of businesses they have. So something that we take for granted in the US, Uber. Drivers and riders find each other using GPS-enabled smartphones. In the US, the drivers are contractors. The wages aren't necessarily good. They're not actually, they're not employees. And Uber has a crazy valuation. It looks nothing like that in Germany or Sweden or Nigeria or Indonesia or China or India. These are all companies that we've examined. It's not like the technology forces you to use it in one particular way. It incubates in a particular national culture. And in the US, we love markets. And so you give us a technology, we're going to use it to enable markets. But it looks very different, particularly outside of the English-speaking world. So I think there are other models out there, but I want to leave with some optimism here. We now have the tools to enable democracy and humane enterprises at a much more rampant level. Shareholder capitalism, something will happen with it, but we've got so many alternatives available to us now. We've got the tools to create a much more humane and democratic future. It's just up to us to design that future. It's up to all of the undergraduates in particular to design this more desirable, humane future. And now that I've met the honors students here, I feel complete confidence that you're going to fix it all for us. So thank you for your service, honors students. I think that's it. Good. Thank you so much. I do have to say, just remember, the first talk is supposed to raise all of the questions. It's up to all of those other speakers to answer them. So I've done my job for the evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you. And he is right that was supposed to raise lots of questions, so please come back next week and all of the other weeks when we have guest speakers to hear different ideas about how to solve these problems. Thank you for coming tonight.